It started as a joke, the night shift at the McDonald's off the interstate exit, a temporary gig to keep the lights on while I figured things out. But that was 6 months ago, and you don't figure things out on the graveyard shift, you just survive it. The first thing my trainer, a gaunt man named Leo with eyes that had seen too many sunrises through grease-stained windows, told me was to forget everything I thought I knew about customer service. He didn't say it with a smile. He slid a single laminated sheet of paper across the stainless steel prep table. It was titled Protocol for the Quiet Hours. It looked like it had been typed on a typewriter from the 70s, the font slightly misaligned and faded. Rule 1, he said, his voice a low monotone. The lobby doors lock automatically at midnight. Do not, under any circumstances, unlock them for anyone. Not for a crying woman, not for a man in a uniform, not for anyone. You just point to the closed sign and shake your head. I laughed, thinking he was messing with the new guy. Leo didn't laugh back. Rule 2, the drive-through microphone is to be muted between 1:07 a.m. and 1:17 a.m. exactly. You not take orders during that time. If a car pulls up, you let them sit at the menu board until the time passes. If they drive off, good. If they don't, you take their order after 1:17. Rule 3, if you are mopping the floor and the water in your bucket turns a murky, dark brown, like old coffee, you are to stop immediately. Empty the bucket into the sink in the back, not the floor drain, and do not resume mopping for the rest of the night. Just leave the wet floor sign out. Rule 4, the ice cream machine is always operational for us. If it ever shows an error code, specifically the E17 code, you are to unplug it, walk to the walk-in freezer, and stay there for 10 minutes. Do not come out early. Rule 5, this one he made me repeat back to him, the most important one. When making the hourly check of the playground, you count the children. There are always 3. If you see more, you turn off the interior playground lights from the panel by the manager's office. If you see fewer, you go to the freezer, same as Rule 4. I asked him what children, Leo, the place is empty at night. He just looked at me and said, you'll count them. Just do it. The first few nights were quiet, just the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional trucker pulling through for a coffee and a sad-looking burger. I followed the rules, feeling silly. The muted 10 minutes were always eerie, watching a silent car at the menu board, their face illuminated by the glow, waiting. Sometimes they waited the whole time, sometimes they sped off angrily. One night, a minivan stayed the full 10 minutes. When the clock ticked over to 1:17, I clicked the mic and gave my usual tired spiel. Welcome to McDonald's. What can I get for you? There was no response. I could see the silhouette of the driver, just sitting there. I asked again. Nothing. Then, the van slowly pulled forward. I prepared the window, but it didn't stop. It just rolled slowly past, the driver a dark shape that didn't turn its head, and continued out onto the service road and into the night. I checked the playground after that. It was just a plastic cube of tunnels and slides bathed in the dim security lighting. I saw nothing, no one. But I counted anyway, forcing my eyes to focus. 1, 2, 3. Small shapes huddled in the ball pit, in the top of the slide, in the crawl tube. My breath caught. They were just shadows, tricks of the light, I told myself. But the next hour, I counted again. 1, 2, 3. They were in different positions. It had to be my mind playing games. A month in, I had my first real incident. It was a slow night, raining hard, making the asphalt of the parking lot shine like a black river. I was mopping the lobby, the rhythmic swish and splash a monotonous soundtrack. I was thinking about nothing, just counting the tiles, when I noticed the water in the bucket. It was changing. The clear, soapy water was clouding, then turning a light tan, then a deep, murky brown, the color of strong tea left to stew. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Rule 3. I stopped mid-swipe. my heart hammering against my ribs. I carefully picked up the bucket, the brown water sloshing ominously, and walked to the back. I poured it down the utility sink, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain. It smelled faintly of soil and something else, something sweet and rotten. I didn't mop again that night. I told Leo about it the next evening when he came in. He just nodded, as if I told him I'd restocked the ketchup packets. He said, "Good. You didn't ignore it. Some guys ignore it. They don't last long." I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't want to know. The real trouble started with the ice cream machine. It was around 2 a.m., and a car had come through asking for cones. I went to make them, and the machine, a miracle in itself, was working fine. As I was finishing, the screen on the machine flickered and went blank for a second before lighting up with 2 words. Error E17. A jolt of pure fear went through me. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the power cord from the wall, the plug coming free with a spark, and practically ran to the walk-in freezer. The heavy door swung shut behind me with a definitive thud, plunging me into a world of stark, frigid air and the hum of compressors. The cold was immediate and biting. I stood there, surrounded by boxes of frozen patties and bags of fries, my breath pluming in the air, and I counted. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. I got to about 300 when I heard it. A sound from the other side of the door. It wasn't a knock. It was a slow, deliberate scraping, like someone dragging their fingernails down the length of the metal door. I stopped counting, my blood turning to ice. The scraping stopped. Then came a soft, wet sound, a kind of squelching tap, like a soaped sponge being pressed against the door. It moved from the top to the bottom, slowly. I backed away until I was pressed against the cold metal shelves, my hand over my mouth to stop myself from making a sound. The 10 minutes felt like an hour. When I finally pushed the door open, my body trembling from cold and fear, the kitchen was empty. The lights were all on. Everything was in its place. But the air felt thick, heavy, and it smelled like wet earth. I never saw the E17 code again, but after that, the rules didn't feel silly anymore. They felt like the bars of a cage, the only thing separating me from whatever was outside, or maybe whatever was already inside with me. The playground children became a constant, grim ritual. I would walk to the large window overlooking the plastic fort, and I would count. 1, 2, 3. They were never clear, always just dark smudges in the shapes of small children, but they moved. One night, I saw 4. A 4th shape, smaller than the others, was crouched by the entrance to the slide. My pulse skyrocketed. I didn't freeze. I turned and practically ran to the manager's office, my shoes squeaking on the tile, and flipped the switch for the playground lights. They went out with a click, plunging the colorful tubes and slides into near darkness, lit only by the faint emergency exit signs. I stood at the window, watching. For a long time, nothing. Then, I saw the 4 shapes begin to move, not like children, but like smoke, drifting towards the far wall of the playground enclosure, the one that backed onto the parking lot. They didn't climb or slide, they just flowed, and then they were gone. I left the lights off for the rest of the night. The next hour, when I went to count, the lights were still off. I used the flashlight on my phone, my hand shaking. I shone it into the ball pit, across the slides. 1, 2, 3. They were back. The drive-through became the main source of a deep, gnawing dread. The cars that came through during the muted period were the worst. They never had their headlights on. They were just dark shapes gliding up to the menu board, sitting in silence for 10 minutes, and then gliding away. One night, a car didn't leave. It was an old sedan, paint peeling. It sat through the muted period, and when I finally unmuted the mic, I got no response. It just sat there. I went to the window, thinking I would just wave them on, but as I approached, I saw the driver. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale and waxy in the glow of our lights. He was perfectly still. Then, Very slowly, he turned his head to look at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth was open in a silent, perfect O. He wasn't breathing. I stumbled back from the window, my mind screaming. The car just sat there for another hour, the man unmoving, before it finally rolled away. So slowly I barely noticed it was gone. I started having dreams about the playground, dreams where I was inside the plastic tubes, and the 3 children were there with me. But they weren't children. They were just darkness with weight, pressing in on me, and the smell of wet earth was everywhere. I began to hate the sunrise because it meant my shift was over and I had to go home and try to sleep, only to come back and do it all over again. Leo noticed the change in me. He found me one morning, just staring at the coffee maker, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't pour a cup. He put a hand on my shoulder, a surprisingly human gesture. He said, "You're seeing it now. The place is built on something old. This land, it was a swamp they drained back in the 60s. They never moved what was underneath. The rules are our side of an agreement. You follow them, it follows them. You break them, the agreement is void." He wouldn't say more, but I understood. This wasn't about ghosts, not in the traditional sense. This was something else, something territorial, something that had been here long before the red and yellow logo, and the rules were a ritual to appease it, a way to share the space. The final test came on a night Leo called in sick. I was alone, completely alone for the first time. The silence was different, heavier. I did my rounds, I counted the children, 1, 2, 3, I muted the drive-thru at 1-7. A car pulled up, a dark sedan. It looked familiar. It sat there, a black hole in the night. At 1:17, I unmuted. No sound. I went to the window, a sense of doom settling over me like a physical weight, a heavy blanket smothering any last flicker of courage I had left. It was the same car, that same damned sedan, with its rust-flecked fenders, and a bumper held on by what looked like hope and duct tape. And inside, him. The same man with the waxy, almost plastic-looking skin that reflected the fluorescent drive-through lights in a way that made him seem manufactured, not born. His mouth was still hung open in that perfect, silent O, a black hole in the bottom half of his face. He was staring right at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, and I felt a profound wrongness, the certainty that those eyes were not processing light, were not seeing me as a person, but as a point of data, a variable in some terrible equation. Then, with a stiffness that was utterly inhuman, as if his joints were made of rusted metal, he lifted a hand. His fingers were long and pale, and he pointed. Not at my face, not at the cash register, but past me, through the wall of the serving area, directly into the heart of the restaurant. He was pointing towards the playground. A cold dread, colder than the walk-in freezer, washed through me. I turned, my neck creaking with attention, to look through the interior service window that gave a view of the dining area and the plastic fortress beyond. The interior lights were on, casting a sickly yellow glow on the abandoned tables and chairs, but the playground was dark, its lights still off from my last harrowed check after I'd seen the fourth shape. I could see nothing in that darkness, just the vague, hulking shapes of the slide and the ball pit, a cave of primary colors swallowed by shadow. But I felt something from that direction, a pressure, a watchfulness that was far more acute than the empty gaze of the man in the car. When I forced myself to turn back to the drive-through window, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest, the driver's seat was empty. The car was still running, a low, rattling purr that seemed to vibrate through the glass. The seat was just vacant. He hadn't opened the door, I hadn't heard a sound, he was just gone. A cold, pure panic seized me, bypassing all thought and launching me into motion. I ran. I abandoned my post, the headset still on my ear, its cord snapping taut and then falling away as I sprinted through the kitchen, past the silent grills and the beeping fryers, towards the manager's office. I slammed the door shut behind me, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead silence, and my fumbling fingers found the lock, a cheap, flimsy button in the center of the knob. I turned it, hearing the faint, pathetic click. It was a rule we were never, ever supposed to break. The office was not a safe room. Only the freezer was a safe room. But the freezer was across the kitchen, a vast and exposed distance, and the thing, whatever it was already inside. I knew it. I could feel it in the air, a change in pressure, a new scent beneath the grease and sanitizer, the smell of wet earth and deep, still water. I collapsed into the cheap, swiveling office chair, its fabric torn and spilling yellowed foam. I listened, straining to hear over the frantic pounding of my own blood in my ears. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator units, the dull buzz of the fluorescent light above me. Then I heard it. A soft, wet tap from the lobby. It was the same sound I had heard outside the freezer door weeks ago, a sound that had haunted my dreams. Tap. A pause, then a squelch, like a footstep in saturated ground. Then another tap. It was moving. It was inside the lobby. I could hear it dragging itself across the tile floor, a slow, deliberate, slithering scrape followed by that awful wet impact. The rules were broken, or maybe they were being tested to their absolute limit. The thing about the freezer, Leo had said, was that it was a safe room, a timeout, a neutral zone, but I was in the office. I had broken protocol. My mind, racing and frantic, latched onto a new, terrifying thought. What if the playground children weren't the threat themselves? What if they were the sentinels, the markers, a boundary line drawn in some invisible energy? I had seen 4. I had broken the count. I had introduced an error into the system. And now something else, something that the sentinels were meant to keep watch for, had found the gap I created and had come in. The tapping was getting closer. It had moved from the lobby, through the archway, and into the main serving area. I could track its progress by the sound, a horrifying map of its approach. Scrape, squelch, tap. It was in the kitchen now. I could hear it moving past the prep tables, its wet form dragging against the stainless steel legs. The sound was right outside the office door. Then, silence. A sudden, absolute silence that was somehow worse than the noise. I held my breath, my lungs burning, my eyes glued to the thin strip of yellow light under the door. A shadow moved, thick and blotting, completely blocking the light. The darkness under the door became absolute. Then, a brown, viscous liquid began to seep under the door. It wasn't water. It was thick, like syrup, and it moved with a sluggish, sentient purpose. It was the same color as the water from the mop bucket, the color of old coffee, of stagnant pond scum, of the swamp Leo said was underneath us. It spread slowly across the gray tile of the office floor, a dark, advancing stain. The smell hit me then, overwhelming and vile, the smell of decay, of rotted leaves and things buried deep in the mud for a very long time. I knew then, with a clarity that felt like a shard of ice in my soul, that Leo was wrong. This was not an agreement. This was not a peaceful coexistence. The rules weren't for our mutual benefit. They were a feeding schedule, a carefully designed set of parameters that kept the thing in the swamp placated, that directed its attention away from us, the temporary occupants of its land. By breaking the count, by hiding in the wrong room, I had stepped out of my designated safe zone and onto the menu. I had just become the main course. The door handle began to jiggle. It started softly, a metallic rattling, as if someone was gently testing it. Then it grew more violent, a frantic, angry shaking. The whole door shuddered in its flimsy frame, the cheap wood groaning under the assault. I scrambled back, pushing with my heels, until I was crammed into the corner where the wall met the filing cabinet. I pulled my knees up to my chest, making myself as small as possible, a child's futile attempt at invisibility. I stared at the door, waiting for the wood to splinter, for the lock to explode inward, for that darkness to come pouring in. The shaking was so violent, I thought the whole prefab wall would come down. But it didn't. As suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged, sobbing gasps of my own breathing. The thick shadow under the door vanished, and the thin line of light reappeared. The brown liquid, which had spread almost to my feet, stopped its advance. Then, impossibly, it began to recede. It wasn't drying up. It was pulling back, retreating towards the door crack, flowing against gravity as if being sucked back out, vanishing from sight as cleanly as if it had never been there at all. The smell of decay faded, replaced once more by the mundane sense of old coffee and industrial cleaner. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stayed in that corner, curled into a ball, for what felt like an eternity. I watched the digital clock on the manager's desk, its red numbers ticking forward with agonizing slowness. I watched as the deep blackness outside the office's small, reinforced window began to soften into a dull, pre-dawn gray. Finally, I heard the sound that meant I had survived. The distinct scratch of a key in the front door lock, followed by the cheerful jingle of the entrance bell. It was the day manager. I waited until I heard his footsteps, his whistling, his routine of turning on the lobby lights before I uncurled my stiff, aching body and unlocked the office door. I pushed it open, half expecting to see some remnant of the night's horror. There was nothing. The tile floor was clean and dry. The kitchen was spotless, everything in its place. The air was normal. The dark sedan was gone from the drive-thru. Everything was relentlessly, terrifyingly normal. The day manager gave me a weird look, asked if I was feeling okay. I just nodded, walked to the front counter, took off my stupid visor and my name tag, and placed them neatly on the formica. I didn't say a word. I just walked out the front door into the cool morning air, and I never went back. I got a day job at a warehouse, a mindless, physical job where the biggest fear is a paper cut or a sore back. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving home from a friend's house or just couldn't sleep, I'll see the glow of the golden arches in the distance, a beacon of false cheer in the darkness, and I'll remember. I'll remember the feeling of that cold freezer, the sight of those three dark shapes shifting in the ball pit, the sound of that wet, dragging tap on the door, and the absolute certainty of being prey. And I know, with a conviction that chills me to the bone, that the rules are still being followed over there, the count is still being taken every hour, and the quiet hours are still holding back something that is very, very old and very, very hungry, waiting in the drained swamp beneath the foundation, patient, eternal, just following the rules.